It arrived on a Tuesday morning, a letter written in a copperplate hand so perfect it belonged to a vanished era, an invitation to a weekend in the country. It promised tea, old friends, and the quiet comfort of a Georgian manor. But at Rosemount House, comfort is just a veneer. Beneath the polished silver and the manicured gardens lies a secret that is about to turn a peaceful reunion into a crime scene. Welcome to Whisper Theory. Today, we unravel the mystery of the guest who never woke up. Our story begins with Miss Marple, a woman who knows that human nature is the same whether in a small village or a grand estate. She accepts an invitation from an old acquaintance, Mrs. Constance Hartwell. Constance was known for two things: her sensible nature and a slight clumsiness with her gloves. But as Miss Marple would soon discover, Mrs. Hartwell had evolved. She was no longer just a sensible girl. She was the mistress of Rosemount House, a place where beauty was maintained with a discipline bordering on obsession. The journey to Little Wickham was idyllic. The September sun hung low over the Hampshire hedges, and Rosemount House itself was a vision of mellow brick and welcoming glass. It seemed like the perfect setting for a gathering of six old friends. But as any student of mystery knows, the more perfect the setting, the darker the shadow it casts. Let's look at the players in this tragedy. First, our hostess, Mrs. Hartwell, a woman of grace who ran her home with the precision of a military commander. Then, Colonel Bantry, a man who treated every social interaction like a tactical exercise. We have Mr. Gerald Thornfield, a retired diplomat who weighed every word as if it cost a pound sterling. And the colorful Miss Euphemia Trent, an artist draped in flowing scarves and jewelry that chimed like alarm bells whenever she moved. Finally, there was the outsider, Mr. Alistair Finch. A businessman from London, Finch was new to the area and the purchaser of the old Wickham estate. He was a man of schedules, ledgers, and rigid punctuality. But as the guests sat down to a dinner of exquisite food and polite conversation, Miss Marple noticed the cracks in the porcelain. Mr. Finch was distracted. He spoke of business pressures and an early start the next morning. He was a man running out of time, though he didn't know it yet. The evening concluded with the usual social rituals. Plans were made. Mr. Finch requested breakfast at 7:30 sharp. He was emphatic about it. He retired to his room, and the house fell into the heavy silence of the countryside. Morning arrived with the crisp light of September. The breakfast room at Rosemount was a scene of domestic perfection: gleaming silver, the smell of coffee, and the rustle of Colonel Bantry's newspaper. But there was one empty chair. 7:30 came and went, then 8 o'clock. It was uncharacteristic for Mr. Finch, a man defined by his self-importance and punctuality, to oversleep. The guests made light of it at first. Perhaps he was tired, perhaps the country air was too relaxing. But Miss Marple watched the butter melt on her toast and felt that familiar prickle of unease. Small inconsistencies were piling up like autumn leaves. Mrs. Hartwell, sensing the disruption to her schedule, sent Henderson, the butler, to wake him. Minutes passed, the conversation lagged, and then Henderson returned. His professional mask had slipped. The door was locked. There was no answer. The silence that followed was heavy. The rhythm of the house had hit an obstacle. With a master key in hand, Mrs. Hartwell, accompanied by Miss Marple, ascended the stairs. They walked down the sunlit corridor past the Persian runners to the door at the end. A knock, silence, the turn of a key. As the door swung open, the room looked peaceful. Mr. Finch lay in bed, hands folded, hair combed. He looked like he was sleeping, but the stillness was absolute. The perfection of the room was about to be the very thing that screamed murder. When is a sleeping man not sleeping? When the stillness in the room feels heavy, almost curated. As the door to Mr. Finch's room swung open, the scene that greeted Mrs. Hartwell and Miss Marple was chillingly ordinary. There was no struggle, no overturned furniture, no sign of violence. Mr. Finch lay beneath the covers, his graying hair neat, his hands resting peacefully. To the untrained eye, it was a tragic, natural end. Mrs. Hartwell approached the bed, her voice soft as she called his name. She reached out, touched his shoulder, and recoiled. The color drained from her face. "Oh," she whispered, a single syllable that carried the weight of a life ended. She retreated, shaken, her social grace collapsing for just a moment. But while the hostess mourned, the detective observed. Miss Marple moved to the window, seemingly to give Mrs. Hartwell space, but in reality, she was cataloging the room. And what she saw didn't make sense. On the bedside table stood a small bottle of sleeping powders and a glass of water. The glass was half empty, but here was the first oddity. It was spotless. No fingerprints. It looked as though it had been wiped clean after being used. Who wipes a glass before going to sleep? And then, the bed itself. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The sheets weren't just pulled up, they were tucked in with military precision. Hospital corners, tight, diagonal folds that locked the sheets in place. It was the kind of bed making you see in a medical ward, not in a bachelor's guest room. Mr. Finch was a businessman, untidy in his personal habits. He didn't make his bed like a professional nurse. Someone else had been here. Someone who couldn't resist being tidy, even in the presence of death. The official machinery of the law began to turn. Dr. Haydock arrived, brisk and practical, followed by Inspector Craddock. The diagnosis seemed straightforward: accidental overdose. Mr. Finch, troubled by business worries and insomnia, had taken his chloral hydrate, misjudged the dose, and slipped away. Downstairs, the breakfast room had transformed into a waiting room for suspects. Colonel Bantry declared it a tragic business brought on by stress. Mrs. Bantry arranged flowers nervously, suggesting the poor man was grief-stricken over his late wife. Miss Trent, the artist, was more dramatic. She insisted it wasn't an accident. She claimed to have heard voices in the night, a woman's voice, urgent and hushed. While the police catalogued the obvious, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, listening to the hum of the house. She knew that sudden death acts like a stone thrown into a pond. The ripples reveal things hidden beneath the surface. She watched Miss Trent, whose voice was too shrill, too insistent. She watched Mr. Thornfield, the diplomat, whose fingers tapped a nervous rhythm on his coffee cup. Everyone was performing the role of the shocked guest, but the timing was off. Inspector Craddock came down to announce the preliminary verdict. Accidental overdose. A second dose taken too soon. It was a neat, tidy explanation, just like the room, but Miss Marple wasn't buying it. Her mind kept going back to the inconsistencies. The wiped glass, the hospital corners. And something else. Recall the conversation from breakfast? Mr. Finch was particular about his habits. Would a man so obsessive about his routine make such a clumsy mistake with his medication? And why did the room feel arranged rather than lived in? As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple realized that this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a stage play. Someone in this house had the knowledge to kill, the opportunity to enter the room, and the chilling composure to make it look like an accident. The police were ready to close the file, but the investigation was just beginning. The killer had made the scene perfect, too perfect. And in that perfection lay the first thread of the unraveling. While the dead keep their secrets, the living struggle to keep theirs. Inspector Craddock transformed the cozy library into a tribunal. He was a man of systems and logic, believing that if you pressed people hard enough, the truth would simply squeeze out like juice from a lemon. But Miss Marple knew that in a house like this, truth was often the first thing to be hidden away. Craddock began with the hostess. Mrs. Hartwell, ever the picture of composure, admitted that Mr. Finch had been preoccupied. He was a man with matters to resolve. She confirmed his insomnia and his routine request for chloral hydrate. It all sounded so terribly mundane. A stressed businessman, a sleeping aide, a tragic mistake. Then came Henderson, the butler. Servants are the invisible eyes of any great house. They see everything because no one looks at them. Henderson confirmed he delivered Mr. Finch's tea at 10 p.m. precisely. Mr. Finch was alive, writing letters, and expecting an early appointment. Wait, an early appointment? A man preparing for a morning meeting doesn't usually overdose on sleeping drafts by accident. He needs to be sharp. This was the first crack in the official narrative. The guests were next. Colonel Bantry, blustering and defensive, admitted to seeing Finch in the smoking room at 11:15. He described Finch as agitated, talking about figures and percentages. Mr. Thornfield, the diplomat, was smoother. He admitted to a disagreement regarding local property, the sale of cottages that would evict elderly tenants. A forceful discussion, he called it. But Miss Marple, listening from the hallway, heard the tension in the silence between his words. And then, the wild card, Miss Euphemia Trent. While the men spoke of business, she spoke of atmosphere. She claimed the house was dark, filled with secrets. And then she dropped a bombshell. She hadn't just slept through the night. She had heard voices through the wall, a woman's voice. Low, urgent, past midnight. Inspector Craddock scribbled in his notebook, but he looked skeptical. Was this just the imagination of an artistic temperament? Or had a midnight visitor entered the room of the man who would never wake up? While the inspector focused on timelines, Miss Marple focused on the domestic. She found Polly, the housemaid, polishing silver. Polly noticed things the police didn't. She mentioned a curious detail about the reading lamp in Mr. Finch's room. According to Polly, Mr. Finch had moved the lamp to the left side of the bed, near the window, claiming the rug was slippery on the right. But when the body was found, the lamp was back on the right side. Why does a lamp move? To read better. Perhaps, but if Mr. Finch moved it for safety, why would he move it back before dying? Or did someone else move it back to restore the room to its proper appearance? Miss Marple returned to the upstairs corridor. She looked at the Persian runner rug. It had been smoothed out, but not perfectly. And there, caught on a tiny splinter in the doorframe, at shoulder height was a single thread, sky blue silk. The kind of silk used in the flowing scarves of a certain artistic guest. Craddock was ready to rule it an accident. He saw a tired man and a bottle of pills. Miss Marple saw a moved lamp, a midnight visitor, and a thread of blue silk. The stage had been set, the props arranged. But the actors had left their marks. The investigation was about to move from the library to the garden, where the earth holds footprints and the walls have ears. By noon, the village of Little Wickham had spun its own version of events. The baker's wife blamed the dangerous constitution of London gentlemen. The landlord of the Red Lion claimed that quiet deaths always follow loud quarrels. They were guessing, of course, but sometimes the gossip of the pantry is more accurate than the reports of the police. Miss Marple knew to listen to the staff. In the kitchen, the cook was adamant about one thing: Mr. Finch's routine. Milk for the powders, water for his teeth, she declared. Finch always took his sleeping medicine with warm milk and honey. It was a ritual. Yet, on the bedside table next to the dead man, there was only a glass of water, wiped clean. If Finch took his medicine as he always did, where was the milk glass? And if he didn't, why was the water glass there? The substitution was subtle, but to a domestic eye, it was glaring. Someone had removed the evidence of how the drug was administered and replaced it with a prop. Miss Marple decided to take a stroll, not through the house but around it. She examined the garden wing. Mr. Finch's room had French doors that opened onto a small balcony with stone steps leading down to the lawn. It was a private entrance or a private exit. The stone steps told a story, faint scuff marks, fresh ones. Someone had come up or down these stairs recently, and caught in the iron railing of the balcony, another fragment of blue silk, larger this time, undeniable, but the most damning evidence was on the doors themselves. Around the lock mechanism, there were tiny, fresh scratches, the kind of marks made by metal on metal, someone picking a lock, or perhaps manipulating the latch from the outside in the dark. The locked room wasn't locked from the inside by Mr. Finch. It had been sealed from the outside by a clever trick. Inside, Henderson approached Miss Marple with another piece of the puzzle. He had checked Mr. Finch's pocket watch. Finch was a man obsessed with time. He synchronized his watch with the hall clock every night. But when Henderson found him, the watch had stopped. At 2:20 a.m. Why would a man winding his watch let it stop? Unless he was already dead by 2:20, or unless the watch was stopped deliberately to create a false timeline. Later that evening, the facade of the house party finally cracked. Miss Marple, inadvertently, or perhaps quite intentionally, found herself near the morning room door. Inside, Miss Trent and Mr. Thornfield were no longer playing the roles of polite guests. They were arguing. "The man is dead," Miss Trent hissed, her voice trembling. "What happens to the letters?" "Legal requirements don't disappear," Thornfield replied coldly. "We aren't talking about property deeds," Trent cried out. "We are talking about letters that could destroy reputations." The picture shifted. The dispute wasn't just about cottages or tenants, it was about leverage. Mr. Finch wasn't just a businessman, he was a hoarder of secrets. He held letters that could ruin lives. The motive had mutated. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a crime of passion. It was an execution to silence a blackmailer. But who among them was desperate enough to kill? And who was clever enough to make it look like sleep? Evidence is a fragile thing. It can be wiped away with a cloth, burned in a grate, or torn from a book. But sometimes, the absence of evidence is the loudest clue of all. As evening settled over Rosemount House, the butler, Henderson, sought out Miss Marple again. His conscience was heavier than the silver tray he carried. He revealed that Mr. Finch kept a small, leather ledger in his traveling case, always locked. But after the police had left, Henderson noticed the ledger was unlocked, and inside, a jagged edge where a page used to be. Henderson had caught a glimpse before the page vanished. Figures, dates, local names connected to the Wickham estate. It looked like a list of payments. This wasn't just a diary, it was a ledger of extortion. Someone in the house hadn't just killed Mr. Finch, they had robbed him of his leverage. The killer was cleaning up loose ends. Miss Marple thanked Henderson and retreated to the morning room. But her investigation took a turn from the financial to the biological. The next morning, amidst the tension of the house, she noticed something small, buzzing, and persistent. A wasp. It was September and the insects were sluggish, but this one was determined. It kept returning to a spot on the skirting board, right outside Mr. Finch's room. Miss Marple bent down, her crochet hook in hand, and touched the wood. It was sticky. She brought it to the light. Honey. Suddenly, the pieces clicked. The cook had said Finch took his medicine with milk and honey. The bedside table only had water, but here, in the hallway, was the trace of the real delivery. Someone had carried a tray of warm milk and honey to that room. They had brushed against the wall in the dark, leaving a sweet, sticky trail that only a wasp, and Miss Marple, would notice. Polly, the housemaid, confirmed it. She had found a dessert spoon in the pantry that was sticky as anything and smelled of honey. Someone had tried to wash it in a hurry, in the dark, and failed. The timeline was tightening. Henderson produced a telegram that had arrived too late the previous evening. The message was brief, brutal, and signed simply with the letter E. Remit by Wednesday or the copies go to the solicitors. Wednesday, that was today. Mr. Finch had a deadline. He was squeezing someone for money, and if they didn't pay up, he was going to destroy them legally. The murder wasn't a sudden crime of passion, it was a race against the clock. The killer had to act before Wednesday. Miss Marple explored the house's anatomy. She found the servants' stairs, narrow, steep, and tucked away behind the kitchen. They led directly to the guest wing, bypassing the main corridors where Mrs. Bantry or the Colonel might be awake. The killer didn't need to walk through the front hall. They could move like a ghost from the kitchen, up the back stairs, tray in hand, deposit the poison, and leave via the balcony. The scratches on the French door lock, the honey on the wall, the missing ledger page. It was all pointing to a premeditated execution disguised as a domestic accident. But who knew the house well enough to navigate the back stairs in the dark? The third morning brought a new player to the board. Mr. Bartholomew, Mr. Finch's London solicitor, arrived with the air of a man who charges by the minute. He didn't care about the social graces of Rosemount House. He cared about his client's assets. And what he found in Mr. Finch's remaining papers blew the accidental overdose theory out of the water. He gathered the guests in the drawing room. The atmosphere was brittle. Mrs. Hartwell poured tea, but her hand shook, just a tremor, barely visible, but Miss Marple saw it. My client, Mr. Bartholomew announced, kept meticulous records. The missing ledger pages weren't just about rent or cottages. They dated back further, to the war, the Great War. Mr. Finch had evidence of wartime irregularities, specifically the diversion of medical supplies. The room went cold. This wasn't just embezzlement. This was profiteering on the suffering of wounded soldiers. During the war, while boys were dying in the trenches for lack of medicine, someone had been siphoning off supplies for profit, and Mr. Finch knew who it was. The motive had shifted from financial ruin to total social annihilation and criminal prosecution. As the solicitor interviewed the guests, Miss Marple wandered into the conservatory. There, amidst the smell of damp earth and geraniums, she found Mrs. Hartwell. The hostess wasn't gardening. She was feeding papers into the small heating stove. The flames licked at the edges of what looked like official documents. She was destroying the past. When she saw Miss Marple, she froze, then smiled that practiced, icy smile. Just some old receipts, she said, but the desperation in her eyes told a different story. Meanwhile, the killer tried to lay a false trail. Young Polly found Miss Trent's blue silk scarf stuffed hastily behind a cushion in the drawing room. It was meant to look like it had been hidden there by a guilty Miss Trent. But Miss Marple shook her head. It was too convenient, too staged. Why would Miss Trent hide a scarf downstairs if she had been upstairs? No, this was a plant. Someone was trying to frame the eccentric artist. And then, the final piece of the mechanism fell into place. Henderson, under gentle pressure from Miss Marple, revealed who had prepared the evening milk on the night of the murder. Mrs. Hartwell insisted on doing it herself, he whispered. She said she wanted to ensure the proper dosage. Mrs. Hartwell, the gracious hostess, the woman who remembered everyone's tea preference. She was also a VAD nurse during the war. She knew exactly how to mix chloral hydrate to mask the taste. She knew the lethal dose to the milligram. She had the medical training to kill, the knowledge of the house to move unseen, and the terrifying discipline to tuck the sheets in with hospital corners while a man lay dead in the bed. The solicitor had brought the why. Henderson had provided the how. Now, Miss Marple just needed to force the confession. The perfect crime was about to meet the perfect observer. The most dangerous conversations often happen in the most beautiful places. The walled garden of Rosemount House was a masterpiece of horticultural discipline, nature tamed by a firm hand. It was here that Miss Marple decided to spring her trap. She didn't use handcuffs or warrants. She used a conversation about roses. She invited Mrs. Hartwell for a stroll. The two women walked arm in arm, the picture of genteel friendship. Miss Marple began softly, admiring the pruning. She noted how maintaining a garden required the same skills as nursing, knowing exactly what to cut away to let the rest survive, knowing the precise dosage of water and fertilizer. Neatness becomes second nature, Mrs. Hartwell replied. Her voice was steady, but her posture was rigid. She was a woman holding onto her composure by a thread. Miss Marple pressed gently on the bruise. She brought up the war. She spoke of the responsibility of a young nurse managing supplies, recording treatments, and ensuring that lethal medications were handled with care. She watched Mrs. Hartwell's stride falter. Just for a second. The hostess was remembering the irregularities the solicitor had uncovered, the diverted supplies, the wartime secrets that Mr. Finch had used to fashion a noose around her neck. Then Miss Marple delivered the strike. It must have been a comfort to Mr. Finch, she said innocently, to have a professional prepare his medication that final night, especially since he was so particular about his warm milk and honey. The effect was immediate. Mrs. Hartwell stopped walking. The color vanished from her face. She had spent the last 24 hours believing her staging was perfect. She had wiped the water glass. She had moved the lamp. She had tucked the sheets. But she had forgotten that Henderson, the butler, had seen her in the kitchen. Henderson usually manages such things, Mrs. Hartwell stammered, her defense crumbling. But Henderson said you insisted, Miss Marple countered softly. You wanted to ensure the proper dosage. The air in the garden grew heavy. The implication was clear. You didn't prepare that drink to help him sleep. You prepared it to make sure he never woke up. And the water glass by the bed. That was a lie you constructed after he was dead. Mrs. Hartwell stood amidst her perfect roses, realizing that the old lady with the knitting bag had seen through every layer of her deception. She tried to dismiss it. She tried to retreat into the safety of her status as the lady of the manor. I don't know what you're suggesting, she said, her voice brittle, but Miss Marple simply smiled with a terrifying kind of pity. My dear, she said, I think we both know exactly what I am suggesting. The walk back to the house was silent. Mrs. Hartwell knew the walls were closing in. Inspector Craddock was still inside. The evidence of the honey, the hospital corners, and the wartime blackmail was piling up. The psychological foundation of her perfect crime had been shaken, and the collapse was inevitable. That evening, the drawing room felt less like a social gathering and more like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. The air was thick with unspoken truths. Miss Marple sat in her corner, knitting needles clicking a steady rhythm, the metronome of justice. Earlier that afternoon, Miss Marple and Henderson had laid a physical trap to match the psychological one. They placed a small, sticky piece of paper, supposedly found near the crime scene, on the writing desk. It was a bluff, a piece of theater designed to make the killer sweat. When the news of this new evidence reached Mrs. Hartwell, her teacup rattled against the saucer. Inspector Craddock returned at 5 p.m. He wasn't the polite investigator anymore. He had spoken to Dr. Haydock again. New information, he announced. The chloral hydrate wasn't just an overdose. It was a precise calculation, 10 times the therapeutic dose. The kind of calculation that requires professional medical knowledge. He didn't look at Colonel Bantry. He didn't look at Miss Trent. He looked directly at Mrs. Hartwell. Then Miss Marple spoke. She didn't accuse. She simply unspooled the thread. She asked about the hospital corners on the bed. She asked why a man who always drank milk was found with a glass of water. I'm afraid I wouldn't know, Mrs. Hartwell deflected, her voice tight. But you prepared the drink, Miss Marple persisted. And you had the motive, the blackmail, the wartime profiteering. Mr. Finch was going to take everything, wasn't he? Your home, your reputation, your life. The pressure became too much. The silence stretched until it snapped. Mrs. Hartwell rose, knocking over a side table in her agitation. "This is preposterous," she cried. "I will not be accused in my own home." But the denial was hollow. The stopped watch at 2:20 a.m., the honey traces on the wall, the missing ledger page. It was a tidal wave of facts that no amount of social standing could hold back. "He left me no choice," the scream tore through the room. The mask of the gracious hostess fell away, revealing the desperate woman beneath. "He would have destroyed everything I built," she sobbed. "Everything I worked for." The room froze. It was over. The confession hung in the air, terrible and absolute. She had killed him to save herself, using the very skills she had once used to save soldiers. She had calculated the murder like a prescription. Miss Marple lowered her knitting. She didn't look triumphant. She looked sad. She knew that evil isn't always a monster in the dark. Sometimes it's a tidy woman who loves her garden too much to let a blackmailer take it away. Justice had arrived at Rosemount House, but it brought no joy, only the heavy, inevitable weight of the truth. The confession had shattered the silence, but now it was time to sweep up the pieces. With Mrs. Hartwell slumped in her chair, defeated by her own history, Miss Marple took the floor. She didn't speak like a prosecutor. She spoke like a grandmother explaining a knitting pattern. But the pattern she described was one of calculated death. "It is rarely the dramatic things that solve a crime," she began softly. "It is the tiny matters. The things people overlook because they seem so ordinary." She turned her attention to the honey. It wasn't just a sweetener, it was the smoking gun. Mr. Finch always took his medicine with honey. The wasp in the corridor knew it. The sticky spoon in the pantry proved it, but the bedside table showed only water. "You prepared the mixture in the kitchen," Miss Marple explained, her voice gentle but relentless. "You carried it up, you administered it. And then you removed the evidence, replacing the sticky glass with a clean one filled with water. You tried to erase the method, but nature, in the form of a wasp, remembered." Then she addressed the locked room. "How does a killer exit a room and lock the door from the inside?" Inspector Craddock leaned in, his notebook ready. The answer wasn't magic, it was mechanics. "It was never truly locked," Miss Marple revealed. "Not to a nurse." She described a technique known to hospital staff. A loop of strong silk thread is fitted over the inner bolt of the French doors. The killer steps out onto the balcony, pulls the doors closed, and gives the thread a sharp tug. The bolt slides home. The thread snaps or is pulled free. But Mrs. Hartwell had made a mistake. She used a thread from Miss Trent's scarf, the scarf she had borrowed to frame her friend. A fragment of that blue silk had sheared off and remained caught in the wood grain. That tiny thread, combined with the scratches on the lock, turned an impossible suicide into a mechanical murder. Miss Trent, the artist, finally admitted her part. She wasn't the killer, but she was a witness who fled. She had been in the hallway. She had heard voices, but her cowardice sent her running back to her room. Mrs. Hartwell used that cowardice, planting the scarf downstairs and using the scent of verbena to cast suspicion on the eccentric artist. It was a cruel redirection. Finally, the timeline. The watch stopped at 2:20 a.m. This revealed the cold calculation of the act. The chloral hydrate took time to work. Mrs. Hartwell didn't just kill him and leave. She waited. She returned hours later, when he was dead, to stage the scene. She moved the lamp back to the right. She arranged his hands. And, unable to help herself, she tucked the sheets with hospital corners. Her professional training betrayed her. She made him tidy one last time. As Miss Marple noted, evil can be terribly tidy. It is the human heart that is left untidy in its wake. The morning after the confession, Rosemount House felt like a clock that had stopped ticking. The tension was gone, replaced by an exhausted quiet. Mrs. Hartwell left with dignity, clutching her handbag and giving instructions about the roses, as if she were going on holiday rather than to prison. It was the final performance of a woman who valued appearances above all else. The house party disbanded. The illusion of the perfect English weekend was over. Colonel Bantry packed his bags in silence, his military confidence shaken. He had prided himself on judging character, yet he had dined with a murderer and suspected nothing. Never would have thought it, he muttered. Such a sensible woman. Mr. Thornfield, the diplomat, salvaged what he could. He arranged legal protection for the cottage tenants, the very people Mrs. Hartwell had killed to protect. In a twisted irony, her crime achieved its goal, though she wouldn't be there to see it. The tenants would stay safe, feeding their cats and tending their gardens, never knowing that their security was purchased with a life. Miss Trent left a watercolor of the walled garden as a parting gift. She had learned a hard lesson. True drama isn't found in flowing scarves or imagined ghosts, but in the desperate acts of real people pushed to the brink. The staff dispersed. Henderson, the butler, accepted a position in Scotland. He covered Mrs. Hartwell's portrait with brown paper, folding the corners with the same precision she had taught him. Young Polly found work nearby, a little less cheerful, a little more wise. The house itself stood empty, its windows staring blankly across the lawn. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her window. She watched a thrush hunting for worms on the lawn, methodical, persistent. It reminded her of the case. Detection, she reflected, is simply knowing where to look and refusing to stop until the ground yields its secrets. Mrs. Hartwell was not a monster in the traditional sense. She was a woman who had saved lives in the war, only to take one in peace. She was a gardener who tried to prune away a weed, Mr. Finch, to save her home. But as Miss Marple knew, you cannot cultivate a garden with poison without killing the soil. The mystery of Rosemount House was solved. Justice was served, neat and tidy, but the tragedy remained. A guest didn't wake up for breakfast, and a hostess would never go home again. It serves as a reminder that the most respectable surfaces often hide the deepest cracks. This has been Whisper Theory. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery with us, make sure to like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next shadow.